years ago, my partner Rose and I went interstate for a conference. I was speaking at it, and Rose was doing the tourist thing and seeing the sights. She bought a cup of coffee for a guy who was down on his luck, and unfortunately he assaulted her. He grabbed her and he kissed her and he wouldn't let go. Now, Rose has a trauma history of child sexual abuse, and it felt to her like the longest time before she could unfreeze and break free and run and find me. We had a rough afternoon. Later that night, we were back at our accommodation, and we were tucked into bed together, holding hands and just talking it through. And she had some really big questions for me, like, was I still attracted to her? And I said, oh, my love, of course. This doesn't change how I see you. And then she asked me, would I be upset or angry if she didn't want to be touched? I said, no, of course not. And then she asked, what about if she never wanted to be touched again? I said to her, we will always be friends. Touch or sex will only ever happen if and when and how she wants them to. This is emotionally safer sex. We can make it safe to turn down sex without feeling pressured or shamed, and we can make it safe to initiate sex. And there's a paradox in this, which is that making sex feel safer can actually be really stressful, a little bit like public speaking. So when I told Rose that we would be okay if we never had sex again, I was totally sincere, but a part of my brain was freaking out. What if we never had sex again? What if the whole relationship changed because of this guy? I was scared. But I was also absolutely determined that if we did have sex, it would not be out of a sense of obligation, or because she was scared that I would leave her or worried that I would be angry with her. Now, we did okay. We're still together. She's sitting over there. And we did have sex again quite soon after this event, and it was great. What I found is that making sex emotionally safer makes it more possible to have good sex more often. Now, what do I mean by good sex? Good sex can be quite different to how we're used to talking about it. It can look quite different to what we're used to seeing in films and books. It can be a lot more diverse. So as an example, I once had a panic attack during sex, and it was still good. I am not recommending panic attacks as a sexual technique. It was very embarrassing. I cried. There may have been snot. It was not sexy. But the thing is, Rose and I are really good at helping each other feel safe. So she was chilled. She went and got me a dressing gown to cover up. She made me a cuppa. We went and watched something funny on TV until I calmed down. And then we went back to having sex, and we had a great night. Emotionally safer sex can be much more diverse than we're used to thinking about it. When Rose and I first met, we realized that one way or another we'd both kind of come to this idea that good sex was out of reach for people like us. We hadn't heard much about people with abuse histories going on to have great sex lives, or people with chronic illness like me, or chronic pain conditions, or anxiety. We just weren't candidates for good sex, right? But of course we are, because good sex is much bigger than that. Good sex can be awkward. It can be playful and silly. Maybe somebody farts at a really embarrassing moment, or they get a leg cramp, or they need to pee. That's okay. It can still be a really fantastic experience. Emotionally safer sex isn't about making sex boring. It's about helping us break out of our really limiting ideas about sex. The reason this topic is important to me is because I've also had experiences of bad sex. And I'm not talking about rape. Sometimes we have this idea that if it's not non-consensual sex, rape, molestation, abuse, then it's good sex. At least you're getting some. But there's this whole territory here that's not good. It's entirely possible to have consensual sex with somebody we like and are attracted to and have it leave us feeling sad, lonely, and miserable. And I hated these experiences. I hated not understanding why they happened and not being able to tell when I was going to have a good experience or a bad one, even if I was with the same partner. In fact, they stressed me out so much, I went on to develop a form of sexual dysfunction called vaginismus. And after a relationship ended in my 20s, I decided I was done. I never wanted to experience bad sex again. And until I could make sure that wasn't going to happen, I would just not have sex. So I became celibate for the next 7 years. And I was not happy about this. This is not about being asexual. This was about going to the park and seeing the couple snuggling and being overwhelmed with yearning. Emotionally safer sex has meant, for me, that I no longer experience sexual dysfunction. I get to have good sex, and I never have bad sex. And the reason I'm talking to you about this is because I've learned it wasn't just me. There are many things that can make sex stressful or bad. Most of us at some point in our lives will find that our sex lives also don't fit that perfect people paradigm we're used to seeing. It might be that we are dealing with weight gain or libido changes because of a medication we need to be on, or maybe our partner is recovering from prostate cancer, or perhaps they're trying to work out how they like to have sex since they've come out as transgender. Our lives and bodies are very diverse, and that's true of safety also. What works for me might not work for you. It needs to be created jointly in each partnership. Emotionally safer sex is bigger than just those partnerships though, because it's also about how I feel in my body. And that's about how other people have treated me and my body. And it's about how they talk about sex and about bodies. How we think about sex, who we think of as sexual and what we think sex is for has huge implications. It changes how we talk to our young people about sex, or what sexual health resources we make available for people with disabilities, or how we set up our aged care facilities. When I talk about emotionally safer sex, I get really different responses from people. Some folks say to me, yes, that's what my partner and I do. And some say to me, ooh, that's really interesting. Come over here, I need to learn more about that. And some folks head for the hills, which is fine. But there's one response in particular that made me start talking about this more publicly. So once I was facilitating a mental health support group, and the topic of sex came up, and I floated some of these ideas around. And somebody said to me, no, there is no such thing as emotionally safer sex. Sex is inherently emotionally risky, and there's nothing that can be done about that. And my heart broke for them. I understand that perspective, I've felt that. But that hasn't been my experience. And just as there are things that we can do to help make sex physically safer, there are things that we can do to help make it emotionally safer. So I spent a long time gathering this framework. I went into sexual health counselling, I've read a lot of books, talked to some folks, done a lot of thinking. And there were a number of things that I found useful, such as, for me, one of them is called resetting the norms. That's the name I gave it. We tend to think of intimacy as being a kind of linear path between strangers and lovers, and it only moves in one direction. And we often think of sex in the same way. You reach first base and then second base and so on. I don't do this. I reset my normal back to platonic friendship. So sex the night before doesn't mean that Rose walks in on me in the shower without checking the next morning, or vice versa. And coming to bed naked isn't a signal that I want to have sex, unless that's something Rose and I have agreed that that means. We don't intrude on each other. So I don't have to spend a lot of energy saying no and pushing a partner away. Instead, I get invited to say yes when I want to and step into being sexual. Another thing I found really helpful was working on my language around sex. I needed words for body parts, for activities, for positions, for consent. And although I always knew that I could say no or stop, in practice I'd rarely done that because I found it really uncomfortable. So Rose and I practiced. We would give each other massages, and at some point I would say, stop, and she would stop. And I got to experience what that feels like. I also found that I needed more nuanced language. Sometimes I didn't want to say stop. I just wanted to say, pause. I found that I needed a lot more than yes or no. Another thing that I found really useful was to kind of unpick my ideas of what I'd come to think of as real sex. And we can have some pretty fixed ideas about this. We can kind of treat sex as a formula. I found being bisexual was quite useful in unpicking this, because we think of sex sometimes as being very simple. Foreplay, if you're lucky, penis in vagina, everyone orgasms, and that's the end of it. That's real sex. And anything else is just messing around, not really sex. When that's how I thought of it and a partner would suggest sex, I would sort of check in with myself to see if I was interested by asking myself, can I handle that? And I don't do that anymore. Now I ask myself, what do I feel like? And I might not quite know yet, but maybe I feel like cuddling on the couch. And once I'm there, maybe I feel like kissing. And once I've started kissing, well, who knows where that might lead. I get to follow the thread of my desire. Real sex is anything sexual we do with our bodies, anything sexual, pleasurable, consenting. It can be about hands and mouths and sex toys. When it's about pleasure, it's not even necessarily about erections or orgasms. Sex doesn't have to be a formula. It can be more like a dance. So, emotionally safer sex flips the scripts we're used to. Sex stops being a performance where we can get judged, or something we give up or do to each other, and becomes something we do with. The things that we think exclude us or hold us back often don't have to. For example, I've had post-traumatic stress disorder, which means that my body and brain wired themselves for a really dangerous environment and then stayed that way once the danger had passed. And one of the ways it did that was by turning up some of my senses, really heightening them. So, for example, I used to wake up if a mouse sneezed in a house down the road. Very inconvenient, but nobody was going to sneak up on me. Another sense that turned up for me was my sense of smell. And that made life quite tricky for a while. So I found crowds or strangers in lifts incredibly overwhelming because I would be hit with this intense medley of smell, their shampoo, their cologne, the smell of their sweat. And for the same reasons, sex was quite challenging. Until I came across an internet forum one day of people who had really sensitive smell and cherished it. I mean, these are the kind of people that spent their entire first paycheck buying some rare perfume. It was like spending my life drinking cask wine and stumbling into a fancy wine tasting event. I bought a lot of perfume samples. But I also started to fall in love with my tuned up senses. So when Rose and I wanted to have sex, she would go and have a shower, and she would use some lovely shower gel, and the smell of her skin would be exquisite. Our differences and vulnerabilities and sensitivities, the very things that make us human, can become connection, authenticity, and pleasure. The things that can make sex bad or stressful, when we feel safer, are actually the very things that can make it more beautiful, more joyful, and more intimate. Thank you.